Welcome to the World Unraveled. As always, I'm your gracious host, Brandon Kinnig. I'm going to cease stating the World Unraveled this week because I am going to strive to podcast at least a couple times a week with just the volume of news that we have in the world and particularly in the United States. And this has been a fairly historic week. And I want to start with the off-year elections this past Tuesday. As we all know, Wisconsin was the epicenter when it came to focus by the Trump administration and in particular by Elon Musk, who attempted to buy the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race as he did the presidential race, throwing 25 million of his own money into it, doing a Sunday night appearance, basically giving away $1 million to voters, which is illegal according to the Wisconsin state constitution. And the Attorney General of Wisconsin attempted to fight it in the courts, but none of the courts wanted to take it up. And laws are only good as long as judges are willing to enforce them. And in this case, we apparently are not willing to enforce election laws. On the federal level, we barely have a federal election commission. They're toothless and they don't have a quorum, so they haven't met in almost a year now to even be able to issue fines or penalties against federal candidates. And it appears now on the state level, judges are afraid to touch people like Elon, who are clearly trying to buy elections. But Elon went all in his Sunday night appearance in Green Bay. He claimed that the future of Western civilization depended on this Supreme Court race, which would decide if Democrats were going to maintain their 4-3 advantage on the state's highest court. Why does that matter? Well, last year, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, with this majority, redrew congressional district boundaries to be more fair and represent the will of the voters, who tend to be about 50-50 when it comes to presidential elections and their overall voting habits. Yet the Wisconsin legislature has been heavily gerrymandered to the degree that Republicans typically had 66 seats compared to about 33 seats. It was basically a 66-33 split in the Wisconsin legislature, the lower chamber, despite the fact that the actual voting habits are about 50-50. So the Supreme Court issued new legislative maps last year, and they are expected next to tackle congressional districts where Democrats only have 2 seats compared to the 7 seats or so that Republicans have. And it's expected Democrats will gain anywhere from 2 to 3 seats. So this was on Elon's mind because he is deathly afraid of Democrats regaining the House of Representatives in 2026. And so he spoke to that specifically and said that this is about the future of Western civilization. Well, the people spoke in a very big way this past Tuesday night in Wisconsin. And by a blowout margin, they selected Susan Crawford, the candidate for state Supreme Court supported by the Democrats, over Brad Schimmel, who was the Republican supported candidate. 55 to 45%, 10-point margin, somewhere in the neighborhood of well over 290,000 votes spread. And the interesting thing was that the blowout margin also came during a surge in turnout. So the last time that Wisconsin had an off-year state Supreme Court race was in 2023, and the Democrat won then. But turnout was only about 40% in 2023. And this year, turnout was 52%. And this just single state Supreme Court justice. There was also a superintendent of education race, and then also a ballot referendum on solidifying voter ID into the Wisconsin state constitution. But that was it. But yet you had a 52% turnout this year in this election, which is amazing because that is similar to midterm turnout in Wisconsin for congressional races. So for them to achieve that level of turnout in a state Supreme Court race, well over the 40% turnout they had for the state Supreme Court race in 2023 is remarkable, and it shows that Democrats are energized and motivated because they won by 10 points. And it's also notable that the key takeaway is that Susan Crawford outperformed Kamala Harris in every single county in the state in this race. And there was a shift in support towards the Democrats in this race in particular, compared with the 2024 presidential vote. Um, every single county and city shifted blue, some by incredible margins. There was not one jurisdiction in Wisconsin that remained stable compared to the 2024 presidential race or became more red comparatively. Every single area of the state went more blue, and in particular, Democrats maxed out support in key areas like Dane County, which is the home of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Very liberal county, liberal bastion of the state. And Democrats typically rack up high margins. But turnout reached 78% of 2024 levels in Dane County. And uh, and even in this very blue county, Susan Crawford was able to improve on Harris's vote share by over 7 points. Same thing in Milwaukee County, home of Milwaukee. Um, Also, Green Bay, which is a swing county, was won by Susan Crawford. Incidentally, Green Bay is where Elon Musk held his big Sunday night rally to drive turnout among Republicans. And even places like Kenosha. So Kenosha is in the southeastern part of the state, and it is in Kenosha County. Susan Crawford won that. It's an area that doesn't go blue always, and she won it by a 5 point spread. And then the county between Kenosha and Milwaukee, Racine County, which is the home of Paul Ryan, which has typically been a Republican county, Susan Crawford won that as well, 51 to 49%. So there was just, I mean, a surge in turnout, 10-point blowout margin. People spoke, and clearly they did not want Elon Musk buying this Supreme Court race. And it's also, even though Donald Trump did appear here, he endorsed Brad Schimmel. He spoke about this race several times and the importance of it, reported robocalls. And of course, the political fallout is that both Elon and Trump are trying to downplay the result. Elon called this race, uh, basically painted it as the future of Western civilization. And now the only thing he had to say after election night on Twitter was that the only race that mattered was the referendum to solidify voter ID into the state constitution. That is something that Elon didn't speak about or talk about once on his platform. It was not on his mind compared to the state Supreme Court, which will impact the congressional races in 2026, adding to Democrats' numbers with new competitive seats. But and this wasn't even a race to allow voter ID. Voter ID is already the law of the land in Wisconsin and has been for some time. The referendum merely added it into the state constitution to preserve it and ensure that it can't be overturned by a future legislature. So that's all it did. It was already legal, and now it's solidified as part of the state constitution. So Elon pointing to that as just a distraction. But what is not a coincidence as Trump the day after telling his inner circle and aides around him that Elon is only going to be on for a couple more months and he will leave in May. We'll see if that happens. Trump tends to pivot rather quickly and change his mind on a whim. That would be notable because when this all started back in January, Elon had said that he was going to be in place through 2026, and uh, the thinking among the Washington class and among Republicans more generally was that Elon would not step down until right before the midterms, sometime in the spring of 2026, which would mean, of course, he would be a punching bag for um, uh, everybody who's opposed to his level of power, but also he would continue to drag the administration down. So that again, if that holds, and again, this is up in the air at the moment, this would be clearly a reaction to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race. So this was the shot in the arm that Democrats needed. They have been outperforming in smaller state legislative elections. There were two races that they won in the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives and March, which allowed them to retake the chamber majority control since it was a tie. And in one of those races, it was a Pennsylvania Amish country based seat, Lancaster County, that was a plus, I believe it was a plus 15 Republican district that the Democrats flipped and won. So those have been good signs, but those have been small races. The state Supreme Court race was a statewide race in Wisconsin. It was also the most expensive judicial race in U.S. history. So over 100 million was poured into it. And again, a lot of that was because of Elon and PACs that were aligned and associated with him. And so that's why it was notable because this race was nationalized to a level we hadn't ever seen before. We thought that was the case in 2023 with the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race that Janet Persayets won, but it was even more supercharged and accelerated this year with this race. And you're talking about 52% turnout compared to 40% turnout in 2023, midterm turnout, and Democrats swept it. The other two races were the special congressional races in Florida, which the Democrats did not win. But these were not a complete loss for them either. These two races were Florida Congressional District 1, which is actually in the panhandle of the state and includes Pensacola, um, butts right up to the Alabama state border, also includes Escambia County, Santa Rosa counties. I'm trying to think of what other cities are there in this district. It's also known for the uh, spring break destination for a lot of college students. But this is a very red congressional district, extremely red. In fact, this was the congressional district that had been held by Matt Gaetz until he bowed out so he could become Trump's AG. And then we all know how that turned out. But Matt Gaetz had won it by 32 points, just, less than what were we talking about 5 months ago, last November, 66 to 34%. And even though the Democrats lost it this time around, they narrowed the margin down to just 14 points. So they cut it from a 32-point margin Republican win to a 14-point margin, less than half, which is incredible. And the same goes for Florida's 6th congressional district. That is one that became open due to the being vacated by Mike Waltz, who was nominated to be Trump's national security advisor, who's now in hot water over Signal Gate, Signal Ghazi, with this national security threads, including the bombing of Yemen that were done over those signal based chats. And so that became vacated and required a special election. This congressional district centers just below St. Augustine, Florida. So we're talking about the northeastern part of the state, includes Palm Coast, Daytona Beach, um, portions of Duval County that don't include St. Augustine, includes uh, Ocala, Florida, Sanford, but really South Daytona, Daytona Beach, and Palm Coast are the largest urban areas. This is also another heavily Republican district. And keep in mind, Florida is a Republican state now, but these two congressional districts are the most Republican drawn districts in the state of Florida. And like Florida won, this district was won by Mike Waltz just 5 months ago by a 33-point margin. And Josh Well, the Democrat, was able to narrow the margin against Randy Fine, the Republican, to just 14 points. Again, which is just, and I mean, remarkable to see the margin driven in half in two of Florida's most reddest congressional districts. And what's interesting too is that Trump won both of uh, these congressional districts by extremely large amounts. Very similar. I think he ran up. Um, oh gosh, what was it? It was over 22 points in one, and then over 24 points in another. So the Democrats didn't win these, but they drove down the margins. And if they're able to do that in 2026 and Republican held seats where Republicans only have a plus 15 net advantage or less, then Democrats win those seats. And there's a lot of Republican held seats that are plus 15 or less. This is another reason why the Trump administration, ahead of this, pulled back their nomination of Elise Stefanik to be UN ambassador because they saw the polling and the fear was very real that her upper New York State Adirondacks based congressional district would flip and become Dem at a time when Mike Johnson can't lose any seats. That he has such a very narrow Republican majority in the House. And at least Stefanik's New York congressional district has gone Dem before. It went Dem back in 2018, I believe, for 2 years, and it has in the past. It does get swingy when the national environment turns against Republicans, and that's an environment we're facing right now. Again, the Democrats have a lot of work to do in terms of messaging, in terms of party coherence, and being able to unify the ranks on common messaging, being able to stand up and fight against much of this legislation and much of the power grabs that are happening from the executive branch and from outside it via Elon. But these elections are a start, and they indicate that the voters are hungry to see somebody fight back, and they're motivated and they're active and they want to register their disapproval with what's happening just in the last 6 weeks. And I have seen a lot of the talk. Granted, the dynamic has shifted since the early aughts and during the Obama era, where it used to be the Democratic coalition was comprised of a lot of low propensity voters who the Democrats struggled to get to turn out in midterms, uh, and they could only get them out for presidential. That has flipped now. The Democratic Party has high propensity voters, many of whom tend to read the news, know what's going on, turn out regularly to vote, while the Republican Party has a much higher percentage of low propensity voters now who only turn out in presidential elections when Trump is on the ballot. But even with that in mind, I think what this shows is that Democrats are superseding even that aspect of it. Because thanks to Elon, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court was nationalized. Both Trump and Elon nationalized it. And the difference between now and 2023 is that Trump is president again. He wasn't in 2023, and Elon wasn't involved in the 2023 race like he was this time around. And yet, despite all that, they weren't able to outpace the Democratic turnout advantage. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think it speak to the moment. And Democrats are going to have to harness that energy and carry it forward into 2026 and find ways that they can capitalize on it, leverage it, and do so in a way that's sincere. And so I do want to pivot. Democrats and voters, more in particular, want a party that's going to fight, that's going to push back. We're starting to see that a little bit. um, Congressman Adam Schiff, I'm sorry, Congressman, he's senator now. I keep wanting to say Congressman. Senator Adam Schiff of California has put a hold on the nomination of the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. So that is Edward Martin. So this is the crazy guy who used to be part of the um, Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum, used to represent that group as a lawyer originally from Missouri. He's the one, as soon as he became attorney, U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, made statements saying that he was Trump's attorney and that his mission and job was to act on behalf of Trump. And he has made it clear that he's going to go after Democrats for the language they use, has threatened to arrest and jail people that speak out against what Elon is doing to the federal government. So he's taken his role, which is to represent the people of DC, and he's transforming it into being the personal attorney for the president, which the president already has that. It's the attorney general. It shouldn't be that way, but Pam Bondi is basically Trump's lapdog. So a lot of these people are pretty crazy, but Edward Martin is one of the more nutty, crazy ones, and probably more dangerous ones as well. It's also notable he's the first U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia to not have prior experience on the federal bench as either a federal prosecutor or a judge. So he's very inexperienced, and in normal times, somebody like him would not get appointed. And there would have been a pushback effort long ago. All that said, Senator Adam Schiff is putting a hold on him, and that's good. Like this is the stuff that I would have loved to see right out of the gate when Trump, just immediately, just blew down the doors to the White House with his pardons of the January 6th insurrectionists and with the slew of executive orders, attempting to remake the government and ending birthright citizenship, which is a constitutional provision that would have to go through Congress. But at least they're finally doing something now. And with that in mind, I also want to acknowledge Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, what he did this week. He gave a 25-hour speech, not only broke a record for the longest filibuster speech ever, but he broke the record that was set by notable segregationist Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. And this was 68 years ago when Strom Thurmond filibustered for 24 hours and 18 minutes in opposition to the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And, thankfully that filibuster didn't have an impact, and the 1957 Civil Rights Act was passed and signed into law by one of my favorite presidents, and native Kansan, Dwight Eisenhower. But I think it's fitting to see a black man as U.S. Senator break a record held by a segregationist in opposition to something that was morally right. And Cory Booker, it's fascinating too because you wonder the nuances of this. Like, how was he able to do this? Like, he literally stood for 25 hours. He did not sit down once. He did not leave to go to the bathroom. And he spoke the entire time and spoke on topic. Strom Thurmond, back when he held his 24-hour marathon filibuster, read from the encyclopedia and, filled that time with a lot of just, gibberish. But Cory Booker didn't do that. He spoke on the moment the entire time. And there were parts of his speech that resonated extremely for the threats to democracy and for the fact that this is not normal and that something has changed in America. And it's going to take acts like this out of the norm to draw attention to it. And so I just want to play a couple of excerpts from his speech because I think they are worth remembering. And even though this did not impact legislation, what he did this week will live on. And I think it provides a roadmap and a blueprint for Democrats to actually use their Senate powers to delay, to hold up legislation. I'm sorry, Republicans have done this for a number of years now. Democrats have been reluctant to do so. But as a body, the Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body. It's supposed to be slower to act. The House of Representatives has always been a more partisan body that rushes in, passes legislation. The Senate deliberates. It tends to be more moderate, or it used to be. And so Democrats should use every tool at their disposal, even if that includes a 25-hour filibuster, because guess what? That 25-hour filibuster, that's time that Republicans, can't ram through, Trump's agenda. And it's also time where the news cycle can be diverted to focus on the critical topics that Cory Booker brought up. So here's just a couple of recorded excerpts from his 25-hour marathon speech.
To the cops I stood with at the funeral of one of their colleagues in Newark 2 weeks ago. Social security offices being closed already. And the question of why, under the guise of efficiency, but you're hurting our elders who deserve dignity in their retirement. It's stunning to me. I've had farmers from New Jersey to Texas coming to my office about this president freezing contracts we approved in a bipartisan manner, putting them in financial crisis. Not right or left, it's right or wrong. Not a partisan moment, it's an American moment. It's a moral moment. Does the wealth of our people, we have more billionaires than any other country, does that speak to the greatness of our nation? No. I think the things that speak to the greatness of a nation is how do we take care of each other? I ask you, are you better off than you were 72 days ago economically? I ask that question. Ask it to your friends. Are they better off economically? Well, I don't see how they could be because prices are up, stock market's down, the risk of recession is climbing, consumer confidence is in the gutter. I want to stand here today and tell you I'm going to do everything I can. I'm willing to go to some lengths. I am inadequate. You are inadequate. We're senators with all of this power, but in this democracy, the power of the people is greater than the people in power. This is a moral moment that more Americans need to stand up and say enough is enough. Moment where judges rule in his favor and he praises them. They just don't rule for him. He drags them and threatens them. So much so that Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to tell them to back up. When elected officials, speak up, many of them fear what the consequences would be for them or their reelection and speak against him.
So again, just a few excerpts of that 25-hour speech, but hopefully, this is the first shot in an energized Democratic Party, at least some Democrats in the Senate and House that are willing to stand up. And we're seeing some things today. Uh, you know, uh, it was interesting. Trump was able to pivot from the show of force against him in Tuesday's off-year elections and Cory Booker's eye-opening and resonating speech to his Liberation Day implementation of these tariffs. And it was interesting because Trump attempted this week, uh, lose track of everything that's happening. So this was yesterday, Wednesday. Trump waited until after the markets closed because he knew the impact would be brutal to announce these tariffs. And these tariffs are broad ranging, not surgical in scope. They impact 185 different countries, including many of our allies. and there's no rhyme or reason to it. And I think what's, interesting too is that um, one of our leading trade partners is Canada, and we get a lot of imports from Canada. We depend very heavily on them for lumber, automobile manufacturing, and people speak about the trade imbalance with Canada, but there really isn't one. If you take oil out of the equation, there isn't any trade imbalance at all with Canada, and yet we are penalizing them as part of this ridiculous and obsessive effort on tariffs, and which we know tariffs don't work. This reminds me of one of my favorite films, the 1980s flick Ferris Bueller's Day Off. There's a scene in that film where the history teacher, played by Ben Stein, is attempting to teach a lesson to the class, and of course he's speaking in his monotone voice, and the class isn't paying attention. But he's trying to remind them in 1930, the Republican controlled the House of Representatives in an effort to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression, passed the tariff bill. And he goes on, but basically says this was the Holly Smooth Tariff Act, which raised tariffs in an effort to collect revenue for the federal government, which is something that Trump's cronies are claiming they're going to do with this broad ranging tariff policy. But guess what? In 1930, the Holly Smoot Act did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. So again, we have history that shows us that this doesn't work. Trump's hero, President McKinley, implemented tariffs in 1890 that were devastating and caused a huge spike in inflation on consumer goods. And it reduced economic output. It resulted in Democrats winning the House of Representatives back that was Republican controlled in 1892. And it's one reason that the tariffs weren't tried again until really 1930. And for the last 5 or 6 decades, Republicans have had a free trade stance because we have history to remind us that tariffs don't work. But anyway, we're putting tariffs against 185 countries. The Senate did vote on a resolution. They passed it 52 to 48 against the Canadian tariffs, and there were 4 Republicans that joined them. There is an opportunity here for Congress to reclaim its authority because tariffs were an authority that Congress had always maintained. And gradually over time, they've let the executive take that, and Trump is running with it. But if they actually ever grew a pair of balls, the Congress could take that back and they could regulate it and say, no, this is not the president's purview. This is our purview, and actually pass legislation codifying that. But they haven't. But I do want to draw attention to the fact that all of these tariff rates were announced and they're just completely ridiculous. They were billed as reciprocal tariff rates, but the actual calculations don't make any sense. So the White House is saying that they are looking at the imbalance between imports and exports to the US. Our trade deficit, they're taking our trade deficit with a particular country, dividing that by the exports to us. And then, Trump is then saying he then divides that number by two to be quote unquote kind. And that's how he comes up with the import tax for these countries. So how does this work in reality? So, for example, Cambodia in Southeast Asia is one of the poorest countries on earth, and it has a tariff rate for imports into its country of 12%. And so it obviously maintains a huge trade imbalance with the US, though, because it's very poor and it's a massive manufacturer of such things such as clothing and shoes, which are exports to the United States and to European countries. Cambodian exports to the US are about 10 billion a year compared to imports that they make of less than 300 million in US products. So on the surface, you would say, oh, that's not fair, or that looks inherently unfair. But you're not taking into account the economic situation and the economic difference um, in terms of GDP between the two countries. For example, Cambodia has a GDP of 42.34 million billion, 42.34 billion, compared to the US, which has a GDP of 27.72 trillion. So 42 billion total gross domestic product for Cambodia compared to 27 trillion. Those are nowhere near in the same ballpark at all. So it's unrealistic to expect uh, a country like Cambodia to be able to import as much, if not more, from the United States than it exports to the United States because it's a poor country and the demand isn't going to be there. And there isn't the market to import at the same rate as it exports, particularly since it exports very cheap consumer goods. So, but that's the same. It's not even fair to call that an algorithm or a methodology, because there is no methodology here. But that calculation that the Trump administration is doing by just looking at the overall trade imbalance without taking into account a country's GDP, a country's economic situation, whether or not how regulated their markets are, any of those things that would matter for a traditional economist, they're not taking that into account. So they're just looking at the trade deficit, dividing it by that country's exports to us, and then dividing it by two again. And then that's how they come up with a 49% import tax on Cambodian goods going forward. So right now, Cambodia charges a 12% tariff rate to the United States, and now they're going to be tariffed on goods that they export to us by a 49% rate. So 49% compared to 12%. How is that fair? Anyway, none of it makes sense. There have been some good quotes about this illogical scheme. I think that's probably the best term to call it, as a scheme. And there's a British journalist who said it's hard to state how nonsensical it is. You might as well divide the numbers of apples in your kitchen by the numbers of bagels and then use it to calculate your mortgage rate. To criticize it on political or economic grounds is too generous. It operates below the level of rational thought. But but this is what we are dealing with essentially. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to it, but it's going to have huge impact. It's remaking the US led global order as we know it, hugely destructive to the world economy, extremely destructive to our economy. The markets have tanked. Basically, the market losses earlier today, I'm recording this on Thursday, April 3rd, were the worst losses since 2022 when we were still in the pandemic. So that is an indication of just, I mean, how devastating and destructive this is completely. And Trump is calling it Liberation Day. I mean, really, he's liberating us from our retirement savings. Most people that I talked with, including myself, saw our 401k accounts lose 3% of their value just today alone. And that's on top of the value they'd already lost since the beginning of the year and what's expected to come over the next couple of months. But the impact to consumers is going to be far reaching. On imports, it's going to be extreme. Imported wine, imported cheeses. And most importantly, though, is on vehicles. So the automotive industry and dealerships are going to be reeling over this. There was an impact study done by Bank of America and Goldman Sachs that showed that the average cost for the consumer, or I should say not for the consumer, the average cost per vehicle for foreign made vehicles is going to be anywhere from 5 to 15,000. $5 to $15,000 increase per vehicle. And then for domestic vehicles that are assembled here in the US, the average increase is going to be around $3,200. Now, that's the average increase in cost. That's not what the consumer is going to pay. The consumer is going to pay even more because the average cost to the consumer is also going to include the markup. So the MSRP, which is the retail price that is paid by the consumer on a vehicle will increase by 5 to 15,000, but then also include dealer markup, which is usually between 1 to 5,000. And so that gets you to a total increase of between 6 to 20,000, depending on if you're buying a domestic or foreign vehicle. And let's be honest, there's no vehicle that's purely domestic. So there are foreign manufacturers like Volvo and Nissan and Toyota and Honda and BMW that have some factories here in the US, but they're considered foreign. There are domestic manufacturers like Ford and Chrysler that have a lot of factories here in the US, but in all of these cases, domestic or foreign OEMs, they have factories that produce cars that have that are manufactured with components and raw materials from a variety of countries. So even a Ford factory in the US will produce a vehicle that includes components that come from Mexico, that come from Canada, and so forth. And so that's why the automotive tariffs are going to be far reaching. And there's already the former CEO of Ford said that every vehicle sold in the United States is going to increase in price, full stop. It's not debatable. That's just going to happen. And you have large dealerships that are extremely afraid right now, and they're saying that they are expecting demand to fall. They are going to have to start reducing the inventory that they keep on hand, and they're going to have to start layoffs of sales staff and others. So the ripple effect is going to include a, a, a surge in unemployment for those that work in the automotive industry. So there's no way to sugarcoat this. It's all very bad. But I do think, and I'm not going to say this often, but Democrats would do well to take a page out of Mike Pence's playbook. He posted online, I believe it was a tweet. He said the Trump tariff tax is the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history. These tariffs are nearly 10 times the size of those imposed during the Trump Pence administration, and they'll cost American families over 3,500 per year. That is a really good way to phrase this. Call it the Trump tariff tax. But Democrats, you all have to be on the same page if you're going to do this. You all have to use the same language. Call it a Trump tariff tax. It is a tax. That's what it is. And that's, I think during her campaign, Kamala Harris referred to it as a national sales tax. But tie this to Trump. Call this the Trump tariff tax. Call the broader policy Trumponomics because that's what it is. Again, politics is about marketing. And if you're going to get people to realize and understand the overarching impact on them, you have to put it in very simplistic terms. Trump tariff tax, Trump, Trumponomics. There you go. And also highlight the average cost of families. I think it's going to be much more than 3,500 per year. I think you could probably find a think tank or an organization do a study that would include the average cost of a new home purchase, include the average cost of raw materials if you're going to make additions to your home, whether that's building a deck or a fence, impact of materials there, Canadian lumber, and the impact on consumer goods, everything from strawberries or blueberries, fresh fruit, a lot of which comes from Mexico, tomatoes, imports from Canada, maple syrup, coffee, wine, cheeses, you could come up with an average figure. And so that's what Democrats need to do, and they need to hammer it. And they need to update the figure that, oh, look, the average cost to Americans from the Trump tariff tax has increased this week with the additional tariff that France has now put on, the specific type of wine as part of retaliation. Also, go out there and talk to a local craft brewery owner. Craft breweries, which I love and patronize, are going to face immense headwinds from this tariff tax because of all the importation they do. And they have no recourse. And these are small local community businesses. These were the little guys that, Republicans used to trumpet, up until recently that they supported. So There's a lot of human interest stories that you can find, the Democrats can find here. I feel like I'm giving them lessons in political marketing, but I feel like I have to. So the algorithm for determining these insane tariff rates is ridiculous. It's overreaching, but it's also attacking our allies. It doesn't take into account uh, the different financial economic situations of the countries. I mean, you can't expect a, you know, apples to apples import export ratio um, ex- between very poor and very rich countries, or countries that have, very different um, domestic industries than ourselves. But none of that is being taken into account. And to show how crazy this is, uh, you know, it was also revealed that the original list of countries with tariff rates when it was released included the uninhabited Heard and McDonald Islands, which are near Antarctica. We're imposing tariffs on them. There's no human inhabitants there. So it leads me to, amidst all this darkness, the one humorous question I saw of the day that I wanted to draw attention to, and I don't remember who posted this online, but it was, imagine in 50 years kids having to answer this on a history test and it not being a trick question. Which of the following did Trump not tariff? A, Switzerland, B, Canada, C, penguins, or D, Russia? I think we all know the answer to that. And actually, to be accurate, not just Russia evaded tariffs, but Belarus, Russia's little brother and puppet state, and the only real dictatorship in Europe outside Russia. I did also want to mention, just because this was breaking news only as of a couple hours ago, the top court in South Korea, I'm going to span around the globe and go over to South Korea. I had a whole podcast on the saga involving the impeachment of the South Korean president for attempting to implement martial law, the fact that South Korea pushed back against that, and the courts are holding him accountable, something we haven't been able to do. We also saw that in another um, developing uh, country that's rapidly growing economically and um, via infrastructure and industry, Brazil, which held their president to account when he tried to stage a coup. Again, other countries that have not had democracy for as long as the United States are doing a better job of keeping it and holding officials accountable who try to overturn it. Us, not so much. But the top court in South Korea, their version of the Supreme Court, upheld the impeachment of the South Korean president. So that is a bit of good news on the global front, even though, we have not been able to uphold the same commitment to democracy. So, on the next podcast, I'm going to go deeper into Signalgate, the ramifications of it, the newest developments we've learned. I also want to highlight what has happened with these horrendous and horrifying deportations to the El Salvador slave prison, with some of the developments of people who have now been sent there that were likely not in a Venezuelan criminal gang at all. Now, I want to end this very dark podcast with a few motivating, encouraging words from Senator Cory Booker's speech, and something that really resonated with me. Cory said, "These are not normal times in America, and they should not be treated as such. This is our moral moment. This is when the most precious ideas of our country are being tested. Where does the Constitution live, on paper or in our hearts? In this democracy, the power of people is greater than the people in power." Let's hope that's still the case. So, with that said, the world will keep unraveling, but we'll continue to make sense of it together. Thank you, and see you next time.